Here is a quick thought experiment for you. Do you think the average person checks their phone more or less than 200 times a day? And if you had to put a number on it, what would your estimate be? Whatever number came to mind, here is the interesting part. Whether your estimate is right or wrong doesn't really matter. In fact, the question itself isn't the point. It could have been about trees, traffic lights, population size, or almost anything else. What matters is that before making your estimate, you had already been given a number. If I had asked the same question, but started with a very different number, your estimate might have been different too. Not because you knew more, not because the answer changed, just because the number you were given first changed. So, why does the first number we're given often matter more than we realize? This isn't just something that happened in the thought experiment we started with. The same pattern may appear whenever people estimate, evaluate, and make decisions. And it has a name: anchoring. Anchoring describes a pattern in human judgment in which an initial number becomes a reference point for later estimates and decisions. When we are uncertain about an answer, we rarely start from nothing. Instead, our thinking often begins from a value that is already available to us. Sometimes that number is relevant, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it can even be completely arbitrary, yet it may still shape the estimate we eventually arrive at. A simple example helps illustrate the idea. Imagine you are walking through a market and a handmade object catches your eye. There is no price tag. You have no idea what it might be worth. As you are looking at it, you overhear another customer talking to a friend. That has to be worth at least 500, he says. A moment later, you find yourself wondering how much it might actually be worth. Whether you realize it or not, that earlier number may now be part of your thinking. It hasn't told you what the object is worth, but it may have given your judgment somewhere to start. Then the seller finally puts a price tag on it. 350. And somehow, it feels fairly reasonable. But is 350 actually a reasonable price? Or does it feel reasonable because the number 500 got there first? As examples like this suggest, anchoring can show up in far more situations than we might expect. But that raises an interesting question. How can a number we heard just moments ago end up shaping the way we think? When we are uncertain, we rarely build an estimate from nothing. Instead, we often begin with a value that is already available and work from there. One explanation is often referred to as anchoring and adjustment. According to this view, an initial number becomes a starting point for judgment. From there, we adjust away from that starting point until we arrive at an estimate that seems plausible. The challenge is that we rarely know exactly how far we should adjust. As a result, the adjustment process may stop before we have moved far enough away from the original anchor. The final estimate can therefore remain closer to that initial value than we intended. In this view, anchoring is not necessarily about accepting the anchor as correct. Instead, the anchor serves as a point of departure, and the adjustment that follows may be incomplete. But a starting point may not be the whole story. Another explanation suggests that anchors may influence not only where our estimates begin, but also how those estimates are constructed. According to the selective accessibility model, an anchor may change which information becomes most accessible while we're forming a judgment. The key idea is that we rarely consider every piece of information we know. Instead, some thoughts, memories, and possibilities become easier to access than others at a particular moment. When an anchor is introduced, it may subtly shift that balance. Information that is consistent with the anchor can become more mentally available, while other information may receive less attention. As a result, the judgment we eventually reach may be built from a selective subset of what we know rather than from everything we know. The question then becomes, how does an anchor make some information easier to access than other information? When we are trying to answer a question, we don't simply generate a number. We look for clues, we search our memory for examples, experiences, and knowledge that seem relevant to the judgment we're making. The noteworthy part is that an anchor may influence that search process from the very beginning. Imagine being asked whether the tallest tree in the world is taller or shorter than 1,000 feet. Even if you don't know the answer, and even if 1,000 feet sounds unrealistic, you may find yourself thinking about unusually large trees, record-breaking heights, or other extreme possibilities. If the question had started with 100 feet instead, very different examples might come to mind. Not because you have learned anything new about trees, but because the anchor may have directed your attention toward a different set of possibilities. In this view, anchors may activate information that is consistent with them while leaving other information in the background. As a result, some thoughts become easier to access than others, not because they are necessarily better pieces of evidence, but because they happen to be more available at that moment. Certain examples feel more relevant. Certain possibilities come to mind more quickly. Over time, the estimate we arrive at may be built from a different pool of information than the one we would have considered if a different anchor had been presented. In other words, anchoring may not only influence where a judgment starts, it may also influence which information becomes available while that judgment is being constructed. And this may be one reason why two people with similar knowledge can sometimes arrive at surprisingly different estimates after being exposed to different anchors. Anchoring may be more complex than any single explanation suggests, and part of the reason it continues to attract attention is that its influence may appear across a wide range of situations, such as consumer choices, negotiations, financial decisions, and judgments made under uncertainty. However, reducing the influence of anchoring does not appear to be straightforward. Generating an independent estimate, considering alternative reference points, and actively looking for information that challenges the initial anchor may help reduce its impact, even if the effect cannot always be eliminated entirely. Perhaps the most striking thing about anchoring is that it rarely feels like an influence. Most of the time, it simply feels like we're making a reasonable judgment. And that's exactly why anchoring can be so easy to miss. Of course, the first number we encounter doesn't determine every judgment we make, but it may shape where our thinking begins, which information comes to mind, and the path our reasoning follows from there. So, the next time you're making an estimate, evaluating an offer, or facing an important decision, it may be worth paying attention to the first number, or even the first piece of information you encounter. Because sometimes the most influential factor in a decision is already there before the decision itself begins.